All right, so to introduce our final keynote, I'd actually like to bring on stage Progress's own Sam Basu. Sam is a developer advocate with Progress, a Microsoft MVP, as well as an avid technologist, author, and speaker. Please help me give a round of applause for Sam Basu.
Thank you, Lauren. Morning. There you go. I think Yogesh kind of made this a trend. You have to say good morning and get excited. So every one of you in this room, you are busy, and you have taken time out of your work, away from your families, to come and geek out with us and let us share our tech vision, and we appreciate that a lot, so thank you. If you look at the agenda for today, we have our general sessions this morning, and then we have some pretty cool breakout sessions in the afternoon. So grab plenty of coffee and just buckle up for a solid day of content. Now, the next keynote in our general session this morning is by one of my favorite people in tech, Richard Campbell. And he's going to talk about how a complex developer ecosystem evolves over time. You heard the Google story from Stephen. Now let's hear the Microsoft story. And you'll see that everyone, and we at Progress, we are all trying to do the same things, abstract away any roadblocks so developers get to build modern apps using the tools that we like and be able to target multiple platforms. Now, those of us in the Microsoft circles are not strangers to Richard, but you may need to know this man a little personally to realize that his cranial powers are not normal. You need to drink bourbon with this man to see he has a photographic memory. One sip, and he'll tell you the history of a distillery. If you listen to any of the Geek Outs on .NET Rocks podcast, you'll see the kind of breadth of knowledge he has on supersonic jets, space travel, and much more. So clearly a man of many talents, a true veteran, and a visionary in our tech industry with an enchanting story to tell. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Campbell. Thank you, sir.
Well, good morning. I've been working for the past year on a book about the history of .NET, having lived through it and realizing that some of those people are getting old, and if we don't write this stuff down soon, we're going to lose it. And to take a piece of that and talk more about how .NET evolved into this open source and cross-platform tool, I actually got us jump all the way back to before .NET even shipped. At the PDC in 2000, just down the road in Orlando, was the first time that Microsoft ever spoke publicly about this idea called .NET. Now, there's a lot of things going on at this time that was kind of a surprise. One was that Bill Gates was no longer CEO. He had stepped down in January after the Department of Justice case had resulted in Microsoft being ordered to split up into two companies, an operating system company and an everything else company. Steve Ballmer took over as CEO, and his first mission was to stop that split from happening, and we know that he succeeded with this consent decree, but this is going on at this time. Now, part of the way that Microsoft demonstrated to the Department of Justice that they should not be split up is they were going to be more open with source code, even back then. And at the PDC in 2000, they announced this idea that they would publish both C# and the Common Language Runtime as ECMA specifications. Now, those specifications, the early drafts, were utilized by a very young Miguel Diaz-Casa here in Boston. Then in early 2001, he announced he would make a clean room version of .NET for Linux that he would eventually call Mono. So even before .NET shipped, there were already folks working on making it a cross-platform tool. And of course, the Mono version was actually going to be open source. Now, it would take him a few years to get a usable chunk of code, about 2004 before we'd see Mono really be able to do a lot of anything. But the Mono logo is actually the Spanish word for monkey. It's not one of anything. By 2001, in the fall, we have the release candidates of .NET. And the consent decree is signed in November of 2001. Microsoft stays as one company, but they start this thing called the Shared Source Initiative. Now, the Shared Source Initiative was not open source. What it was availability of source code for companies that needed it involved with Microsoft tools, most specifically Windows. If you think about it, they're talking about shared source at this point before .NET is even shipped. So what they're really doing is saying, for companies that need access to the code to understand problems with their own software, to do debugging, they can have access to Windows code, Office code, and many more things. Shortly after that consent decree is shipped, the consent decree is signed, the ECMA specifications 334 and 335 for C# and CLR are also published. And so in February of 2002, the first version of .NET actually ships. And a month later, in March of 2002, Stephen Wally leads a program to do shared source for the CLR, C# and base class libraries. So this was also not open source. This was an academic license. If you wanted to understand how .NET worked, you could have access to the underlying source code back in 2002. And that was about as friendly as Microsoft was going to get with the open source world at that time. Mono was under development, so there was a bit of a cross-platform story going on. This is also the time when Steve Ballmer says friendly things like Linux is a cancer. And so there's not much to talk about for a few years. Of course, shortly, a year later, 2003, they released 1.1 of .NET. And a couple of years after that, in 2005, they would put out the third version of .NET, which they called version 2, because numbers are hard. And one would argue that the 2005 edition of .NET was kind of the definitive version, that it was what they had originally intended to make. The competitor at this time was Java. And Java's claim to fame was not only cross-platform and open source, but it was one language on any platform. And so Microsoft's marketing pitch in 2002 was 22 languages, one platform, and that one platform being Windows. Now the fun part is trying to figure out 22 languages. And I have a list somewhere, but let's not worry about that right now. The first time we really see an interesting move towards open source, and of course towards an open web, is in 2006. And that's when a not as young man at the time, Scott Guthrie, has now been promoted to General Manager of Developer Division. And he is trying to get Microsoft more engaged with the open web. Now, at that time, Microsoft had two big conferences. They had the PDC, or Professional Developers Conference, which for the past few years had largely been focused on .NET before it shipped, and Windows, because we're coming into the Vista era at this particular point. The other show was TechEd, and TechEd was largely an IT show. So there really wasn't a home for developers that care about the open web. And so they created a new show they called Mix. They did it in Vegas, and this is where they started to have conversations about a more open web mindset. It's also when they finally broke the dry spell for Internet Explorer. IE6 had shipped before XP in 2001, and there hadn't been another browser from Microsoft. They announced IE7 5 years later at Mix 06. That same year, they launched Codeplex. Now, there was some controversy around Codeplex. This was an open source repository primarily aimed at Microsoft projects, which seemed odd to a lot of people. Why make another open source repository? And of course, today, Codeplex is kind of done. In March of 2017, they wound it down. It's still up in a read-only state, but they've largely moved everything they're doing to GitHub. But at first, they wanted to have their own place to put stuff, and that's really what Codeplex was for. Also in 2006, there was the Open Specification Promise. Now, this wave of activity around Microsoft being friendly also had to do with the consent decree. When the consent decree was signed in November of 2001, it was for 5 years. Well, here it is 5 years later in 2006, and there's conversations about whether or not to extend that consent decree, which happens. It gets extended another 3 years, and 2 more after that. It won't end until 2011. The Open Specification Promise was actually a promise by Microsoft to not assert their rights over certain file formats and things that they had patents around. This was not that much about .NET, actually. This included things like the format that Office files were in, the open document specifications, graphic formats, as well as their programming languages. And it was simply a promise. It was a document they put out there that said, you can use this stuff and we promise not to sue you. And isn't that a nice thing to do? So while they're being very positive in this angle, they also ship this thing. Now, there's lots to be said about this product. not entirely Microsoft to blame. There were many forces at work at the same time. A change in the way hardware worked, a change in the way operating system worked. I mean, Microsoft had been putting out a new operating system every year from about 1995 until 2001, and XP had done very, very well for them, and they kind of went crazy. Tried to do all things for this version of Windows. But let's leave that lie and move on to the bigger consequence that it had, which was the thing that they finally shipped that they called Vista. They pushed a lot of bits back out of it, and it landed on the .NET framework. And so there was a version of the .NET framework called 3, which if you're counting was the 4th version, and largely didn't change things in the underpinnings of .NET. What it did land was the code names Avalon and Indigo, which the rule is if you have a great code name, you have a terrible product name, which is why it was called Windows Presentation Foundation and Windows Communications Foundation. But they also hinted at Mix in 2007 that they would take Windows Presentation Foundation and they would do some extensions to it to make it more web-friendly. So it was WPFE, which is a terrible code name, which means what? Great product name. Scott Guthrie's hard at work at this particular point. There's a few things that he's very concerned about. One of them is that it's taking too long for Microsoft to ship software in the development space. We need to move faster. And we're tightly bound to Windows. Windows only comes out every couple of years, it seems, maybe longer. And then they want to ship a new set of dev tools to go along with that. All of this is taking too long. So he starts going out of band. Silverlight was one of his big demonstrations for this, that he would start shipping Silverlight completely independently of the rest of the development tools. In fact, he would put out 4 versions in 10 months. CTP versions, not major rev numbers. He also starts working on a different set of web tooling, which would eventually be called MVC. And he uses that to go on a bit of a recruiting drive. He's thinking open source, and he needs open source soldiers. And so in a span of a month, he hires Scott Guthrie, Phil Hack, and Rob Connery. At the time on .NET Rocks, we called them Scott Guthrie's Ninja Army. And they were all very strong .NET advocates. And they were also very strong open source advocates, which was an odd thing in 2007. It was a very strange moment because the average .NET developer at that time was very much in the mindset of, you never go wrong buying Microsoft. So I would prefer Microsoft tooling over all other things. And these 3 fellows certainly did not think that way. And there was a whole wave of energy around this idea that there were good open source tools for .NET developers to use. And it was contentious. There was eventually a group put together that they called themselves alt.net. And they represented some very strong thinkers about the way you could build software, but they had a strong focus on open source as well. And they invited Scott Guthrie to keynote at their first conference in October of 2007 in Austin, Texas. And he said yes. And it was the first time that they publicly showed MVC, where he demonstrated this idea of a testable, scalable, high potential way of building websites on the Microsoft stack, and kind of surprised everybody. But he's prone to doing that sort of thing. At the same time, they advanced this idea of the shared source initiative to a new level they called the .NET reference source. So now it's not for academics, it's not for developers that are working against Windows or other Microsoft products where they need to see the sources. If you want to see the .NET source code, we'll let you see it. Anybody can. You can't change it, and you certainly can't compile it, but you can see it. In fact, they go so far as to integrate it into Visual Studio 2008. So in Visual Studio 2008, you could actually install an SDK for the .NET reference source so that you can break into your code running in .NET and then jump into executing underlying .NET code at the same time. And this included far more than the original set of shared source libraries, which were just the BCL, CLR, and language stuff. Now they actually had system.data, most of ASP.NET, and even WPF was available there. So this was a fairly large step forward. You still can't really call it open source. Mono's doing its thing at the time as well, doing very well, in fact. And as later versions of Silverlight come along, we're now looking at version 2 and version 3 of Silverlight that have a fair bit of power, a great programming environment. They also work against the Mac. The first version of Silverlight, which the scripting language was actually JavaScript, worked on both the Mac on the PowerPC and the Intel chipsets. Later versions would be Intel only because Apple switched to Intel only. This is also in 2008 when the first version of the Chrome browser appears and the HTML specifications for HTML5 first come along. It's 10 years ago now. Sometimes it's hard to remember, but this is sort of the alignment of all of those things happened at the same time. And the Mono guys, not complacent in any way, actually put out a version of Silverlight for Linux called Moonlight. They get it first running in February of 2009, and it catches up more or less for a little while there. In fact, one would argue the most compelling version of Silverlight as a whole was Silverlight 3, which comes in July of 2009. But now we get into some more challenging times. It was at the PDC where this version of Silverlight and that set of tools come out that they also announced their cloud product, which at that time they called Windows Azure. And that name's important because it changes for a reason. It's released in February of 2010, and it ships with support for SQL, Azure, PHP, Java, and .NET, 2 open source languages, and .NET, right out the gate. Now, the development the environment's a little weird. There's no virtual machine, so people are pretty slow to adopt it, but it has a lot of interesting potential. Now, 2010 is a busy year. I have the chronology laid down pretty carefully here. So February of 2010, we get the first version of Azure. In March of 2010, the really big iPhone appears. Now, the original iPhone came along in 2006, and it wasn't a great phone, but it got rapidly better. But people weren't paying a ton of attention to the iPhone by 2010. When the iPad came out, this was a big deal. This machine did a lot for a fairly reasonable price. Again, it's very important to remember the context here. This was at a time when laptops were driving down the price as hard as possible. Laptops were all plastic. They were trying to get to a $500 laptop, and a $500 laptop is a really bad laptop. And here was this $800 tablet, and it was gorgeous. And so you couldn't make a $500 crappy laptop. There's just no way. You would buy an iPad instead. In some ways, the laptop was saved by this. It moved up. But this device scared Microsoft heavily. But it also had a huge impact on Silverlight. Because right after this is released in March of 2010, Steve Jobs puts out a letter in April of 2010 called Thoughts on Flash. And what he really was describing was concerns about plugins in browsers. They were a vector for malware, they were sources of inefficiency, but let's be honest, Flash was a terrible piece of software, and it killed the battery on the iPad. And that's what he was most concerned about, is this thing would murder the battery on the iPad, makes the iPad look bad. He doesn't like that, so he simply bans plugins from Safari. All the other points he made were legitimate, but in the end, making the iPad run well was the most important thing. There were workarounds. If you used a third-party browser that allowed plugins, you could still put Flash on your iPad and kill your battery just like anybody else could. But if you wanted to run in Safari, you couldn't do it. And that also meant Silverlight. Suddenly, Silverlight was not going to run on the iPad on the default configuration. Nobody noticed publicly at that time, but they'll notice soon enough. In March of 2010, we get Visual Studio 2010. Now, in a lot of ways, this is a very key version of Studio. This is the first time that Microsoft has implemented WPF in one of their own products, which means WPF gets significantly better. It's also when the language F# arrives, and the parallel extensions. Silverlight 4 arrives, and it supports Chrome. It also supports running outside of the browser. So Silverlight, in some ways, was at a high point here. But I would say the single most important thing that happened in Studio 2010 was that it shipped with jQuery. Now, this is a point where everybody sort of sat and went, did Microsoft ship one of their products with an open source library? Yeah, they did. Not only that, but they shipped it with the standard open source license on it. There was plenty of contention about that inside of Microsoft. They wanted to put their own license on it, but that would have been a really dumb thing to do. And eventually they talked themselves out of it and stuck with the standard library for jQuery, the standard license. They also supported jQuery setting up a foundation to create a legal barrier around any potential conflicts that might happen with that open source library. That jQuery foundation would ultimately evolve into what we now know as the JavaScript Foundation, very much modeled after the Linux Foundation. And it was the harbinger of a series of other foundations that would come from there. But including jQuery in the box was this statement to the conservative .NET developer: Microsoft really doesn't hate open source. In fact, they would rather like you to use this. That's why it's in the box. So that's the spring of 2010. The iPad appears, Azure appears, Studio appears. We've had a good spring. Let's talk about the fall. So in the fall of 2010, the very last PDC occurs, and it happens on campus at Microsoft. It's a smaller show, live streamed. So pretty much the audience wouldn't be much bigger than this one. Pretty much, and more or less it was all about the live stream, so you were an applause track if you were actually going to be there. But they didn't talk about Silverlight at the Professional Developers Conference at Microsoft. Didn't talk about it at all. And some people noticed. So a reporter by the name of Mary Jo Foley went to the president of Server and Tools at Microsoft, a man by the name of Bob Muglia, and said, "Why didn't you talk about Silverlight?" And Bob Muglia said a bunch of things, but the line that everybody jumped onto was, "Our strategy has shifted." He was essentially admitting that Silverlight wasn't going to run on the iPad, and that was kind of a big deal, and you would have to go to a different way. The response from the press for this was, "Silverlight is dead." Now, it's not like Silverlight burst into flames at that point. It's that it wasn't going to work on all platforms, and that limits its capabilities. And ultimately, Bob Muglia leaves Microsoft. So that conversation happened in October of 2010. By January of 2011, Bob Muglia is no longer at the company, and the person who replaces him in that role of Server Tools is Satya Nadella. This is also when Anders Hallsberg steps away from C# and starts on a secret project that we'll eventually know as TypeScript. All of these things happen almost at the same time. 2011 is this amazing era. HTML5 is coming true, and Microsoft's working on a new version of the browser, IE9. And the more important part is this thing called the Chakra engine, their underlying JavaScript engine. Google has one called the V8 engine, and the Mozilla folks are working on Nitro at the time. And it's a battle to build the best JavaScript engine you could possibly build. It was friendly co-opetition. They would send each other cakes when they put out a good version. At one point, IE incorporated the GPU for rendering graphics more efficiently, and Chrome immediately followed on that. They went back and forth, faster, faster, faster. And they cleaned up JavaScript in a lot of respects. I think this was the year that JavaScript became a real language, in the sense that it was not just about scripting. It ran fast, it was efficient, it was a smart, dynamic language. And it led to things like Node. Now, Node existed before this sprint, but after this sprint, this idea that we would run JavaScript outside of the browser, that we would use it as a language on our servers, became a practical concept. It was shocking, but it was reasonable. And it opened this idea that what if we could code one way end to end? We don't like working in more languages than we absolutely need to. We want to be able to work on the platforms we want to work on. What if we had more choices there? And I'd be remiss not to mention the Progress folks and the great tool called Kendo UI. For the folks that lived in the .NET world at the time, our boss kept coming down to us and saying, "You got this HTML5 thing, right?" And when Kendo UI came along and it was in a neat little package that we could buy, I'm like, "Yep, got it right here, boss. It's got a good logo." Now I know HTML5. But it actually got a lot of folks started on thinking about modern web development in a different way. The real fallout of the iPad was Win8. And we first really learned about Win 8 in 2011 at the Build conference. So now PDC is gone, Build is the new show. It's in Anaheim, and they talk about Windows 8, Server 2012, a new version of Studio. They also talk about this thing called Win.js. So Microsoft suddenly all in on JavaScript. That huge burst of work that had made JavaScript a stronger language, and this realization that C#, which was the programming language for Silverlight, wasn't going to run on all the platforms, put on this pressure. Which way should we go? If C#'s not going to run everywhere, maybe JavaScript is a better choice. And so this was the position they were making here. The hilarious part is this is September of 2011, and at the very same time, our old friend Miguel is back. He never stopped working on Mono. Actually, he ended up working inside of Novell on Mono, and he'd started building his own version of C# to run on the iPhone. He called it Mono Touch. Ultimately, a company called Attachmate tried to buy Novell. Actually, they did buy Novell and wanted to shut down all of those projects. And he convinced his friend Nat Friedman to form a new company he called Xamarin and grabbed that technology from Attachmate. And at the same time, in 2011, that Microsoft's talking about focusing on JavaScript, he has implemented versions of C# for both the iPhone and Android. Good timing. And so we get to 2012. And in early 2012, Microsoft is far more open source friendly, and they start a thing called MS OpenTech, specifically about cross-platform work. They want to make sure that popular service libraries running on Linux and other platforms work well with the .NET stack. That's their job. And as Studio 2012 comes out, it's got support for the ARM processor, because now we're going to start working on tablets. And at the Build 2012, we see Win 8 ship with Win.js, and they talk about all the great apps that they're building back there on the Windows App Store, and 80% of them are XAML and C#. Well, okay. So Win 8 wasn't the biggest hit as they thought. Studio 2012's biggest complaint was the all caps. In 2013, they took away the all caps on the menus, which is a great improvement. But they also started thinking differently about Windows at that moment. And one of the biggest proof points comes in 2014 when they rename Azure. It's Microsoft Azure now and has been ever since. It's also when Steve Ballmer steps down and Satya Nadella takes over as CEO in February of 2014. All these things happen more or less at the same time. And at the Build event in April of 2014, they announced the .NET Foundation. So now they want to start open sourcing .NET code in a big way. And so the .NET Foundation includes pieces of Xamarin and a bunch of other great libraries written by .NET developers that lots of folks should use. And the foundation, again, is about protecting liability and clarifying ownership, just so that you can, as a large organization, be confident in using open source software. If it's in the .NET Foundation, you know it's safe to use. This is also when Roslyn ships, and it shipped as a cross-platform, open source version of C#. If you're into building programming languages, and I don't know why you would be, because it's a weird thing to do, but there's a small group of people who think it's really fun. One of the basic goals of any good programming language is to eventually write the language in itself. C# had always been written in C++. The Roslyn project, besides making compilers a service, was also about writing C# in C#. It came late, relatively speaking, for the language. But the most important thing I think that did, more than anything else, was it meant that all those folks that work at Microsoft, that work on C#, work in C#. They used to work in C++. Now they work in C#. I think it's one of the reasons the language has evolved so sharply in the past few years, was that announcement. It's also when we finally saw V1 of TypeScript, Anders Heilsberg's latest project. And this is also when we first saw native script appear by Progress in March of 2015. Cross-platform development for iOS and Android focused around JavaScript. A very compelling idea. Visual Studio 2015, also when Win 10 shows up and sort of cleans up the effects of Win 8. Of course, there is no Win 9 because numbering is hard. It's also when MS OpenTech, which had only been started in 2012, rolls into Microsoft, because Microsoft has now disentangled itself in some respects from Windows and is actually taking open source extremely seriously. VS Code appears as an open source way to write code that's becoming exciting for all sorts of folks. You don't have to live in Studio. Studio Code is just an editor. And the ultimate manifestation of this, of course, is Core. They released the first version of Core 1.0 in June of 2016. It had an MIT license, not a Microsoft license. It was deployed through GitHub. The following year, they got 1.1, and then August of 2017, last year, 2.0, and just last month, actually really last week, they shipped Core 2.1. And at Build, we saw them talk about Core 3, hopefully end of this year, early next year. I'm suspecting Build next year is the likely time for that to appear. So we've moved quickly through this series of stories of how Microsoft has tried to be open and then finally had to commit to it. That they tried to be bound to an operating system until they realized it was only harming them and their customers, and then they uncoupled from it. And now you get to program in the language you want, deploy to the machine you want. And so what's coming next is really a discussion about how we want to code. There's a lot of power in the idea of using the same language on the back end as the front end, as we've seen with Node and JavaScript everywhere, and native script certainly plays into that. But you're also seeing with new projects like Blazor that they found a way through WebAssembly to let C# run on the browser as well. So what if it was C# end-to-end? What language makes you happy? What platform makes you happy? You get to choose. We're far from finished. There's lots more to do. And I'm, for one, looking forward to that story. Thank you for your time.